Once again, I request Dr. Anand Prakash and Dr. Mohammad Y. Kasbi, if they are here, to kindly upload your presentations. Once again, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. So it's pouring outside and we all are safe here. And we are about to begin with the theme Policy Interventions in Forestry. For this, we have session moderator as Dr. Courtney Schultz, Professor, Colorado State University, USA. Her research agenda focuses on how policies and other aspects of governance mediate the effective integration of scientific information into decision-making and guide how science is balanced with political goals and public preferences. She has conducted research on large-scale wildlife conservation planning, the development of monitoring and adaptive management plans by federal agencies, and various aspects of forest restoration policy. Her work is grounded in the public administration, adaptive governance, and science policy literatures. So we have with us two speakers, Dr. Prachi Gangwar and Dr. David Andrew Waddle. Session moderators are Dr. S.K. Sharma. Thank you so much. Now I hand over the stage to our session moderator, Dr. Courtney Schultz.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here for our session on policy interventions in forestry. We just have two speakers at this time. So we are going to start with 15-minute presentations from each, and then we will move to questions and discussion. I would like to first introduce Dr. Prachi Gangwar, who is going to talk about Forest Conservation Act, implications of provisions requiring policy intervention for effective implementation. Please welcome Dr. Gangwar.
Honorable Chair and distinguished delegates, and ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to all of you. Before I begin with my presentation, let us look at some statistics. The geographical area of our country is around 328.7 million hectares, and the forest area is 67.7 million hectares. And the land that is diverted annually for various non-forestry purposes is 17,000 hectares per year. So that's a huge figure, I think, and should be alarming enough for all of us to start questioning our acts and policies. And that is what is intended in this paper. My title being Implications of the Provisions Requiring Policy Intervention for Effective Implementation of Forest Conservation Act of 1980. Now this act was basically promulgated to check indiscriminate diversion of forest land. And the objective of the act was diversion of forest land for non-forestry purposes, regulating it, and if it is permitted, it has to be with the permission of the central government with certain conditions imposed. In this paper, I've tried to work on the disparities which are there in the Act, which have to be addressed so as to make the Act more implementable and maybe amenable. Now, this Act came into force on 25th October 1980. However, the rules were first notified on 1st August 1981. Now, the gap between the two left the Act unimplemented effectively for almost a year. The penal provisions in the Act under Section 3A and 3B were inserted by the Forest Amendment Act of 1988. The Act did not define forest. And it was only after a famous T.N. Godavarman case that, upon the orders of the Honorable Supreme Court of India, the forests were defined, and the scope of the forest was extended to include all kinds of forests, irrespective of ownership. So we did not restrict to defining forests only according to the ownership status. And Supreme Court clearly said that this forest would now be defined as per their dictionary meaning. There are certain shortfalls in the perceived achievements of the Act, which would be addressed like here. For division of forest land, equivalent non-forest land has to be acquired, planted, and declared as, if I give you the basic, ideology behind this Act, that was to check indiscriminate division of forest land. So like if any user agency wants to use any forest land for any non-forestry purposes, it has to take permission from the central government, and for the loss of that forest land is actually compensated in terms of compensatory afforestation that is carried out and in terms of net present value that is paid by the user agency. So for compensatory afforestation, it was said it will help to compensate for the loss of that forest land. And it is very clearly defined that this compensatory afforestation has to be raised over some non-forest land, which should be actually adjacent to some forest land so that we can create compact blocks of forest. And so that we are able to actually compensate for the loss of biodiversity. However, what is happening this is as per the CAG report of 2013, that against the receivable non-forest land of around 1 lakh odd hectares, only 28,000 hectares was received during the period 2006-12, which constitutes only 27% of the receivable non-forest land. And this figure also, the compensatory afforestation done over the non-forest land received was abysmal 7,000 odd hectares, constituting only 7% of the land which ought to have been received. So we can clearly see the difference in the land area which was supposed to be afforested and raised as a natural forest or as a forest, and which is not being done. The status of transfer and mutation of non-forest land is also very dismal. Out of 23,000 hectares of non-forest land received by the states, union territories, only 11,000 hectares was transferred and mutated in the name of State Forest Department. And we all know the status of land in our country. It can be a cause of any big, in fact, a war can be raised. So it is very essential actually to not only to raise a plantation but also to change the status of the land and mutate it in favor of the forest department, which we are actually not doing. Out of this also only 3,000 odd hectares was declared as reserve forest and protected forest, which constitutes only 14% of the non-forest land so far received. So we are much behind our actual perceived targets. The non-compliance there are certain non-compliances also of the provisions of the Act. In case of non-availability or short availability of non-forest land, a certificate has to be issued by the Chief Secretary of the state, and then it is permissible to raise afforestation over degraded forest land twice in extent to the area being diverted. But it was observed that compensatory afforestation was allowed over an area of 75,000 hectares without any certificate of the Chief Secretary in almost all the states except these few: Delhi, Himachal Pradesh, Meghalaya and Sikkim. It is only in 2 states, with Chandigarh and Uttarakhand, that equivalent or more non-forest land was received. Now there are also certain procedural flaws in the Act. The penal clause, which is prescribed under Section 3A and 3B of the Forest Conservation Act 1980, it is largely inadequate and ineffective. If you see, the Ministry of Environment and Forest and Climate Change has invoked this penal provision only in 3 cases so far between the period August 2009 to October 2012. So are people not actually violating the Act? No, this is not the case actually. We'll further analyze why is it happening. As per the clause 3B of Forest Conservation Act 1980, an offence under this Act when committed by the head of the department or by any authority or every person who at the time the offence was committed was directly in charge of the business of the authority shall be deemed to be guilty of the offence. Now, what is the flaw in this statement is that whenever a head of any department or the officer in charge of any work other than forest department would issue orders, for carrying out activities which are permitted, which are in fact prohibited under Section 2 of Forest Conservation Act, those would be involving either encroachment of land or illicit felling. But what has happened? Under the Forest Conservation Act guidelines, it is further stated that cases of illicit felling, encroachment, illegal mining will have to be dealt under the provisions of IFA, State Forest Act, Environment Protection Act. So where is the Forest Conservation Act? That means effectively we cannot book any person under Forest Conservation Act 1980. And thus it becomes a big question that how do we actually invoke the Forest Conservation Act? Then, there are certain instances where because of the abeyance or maybe, ignorance of facts, people violate the Act. And in such cases, if we have to actually regularize those violations, penalties are imposed while granting ex post facto approvals, which is like compounding of the case, while there is no such provision in the Act or rules to compound. So under what provision of the Act or the rule are we compounding? This again is questionable. Now the working plans, the status is not very happy in most of the states. The working plans in most of the states are not prepared within time. As such, the necessary works in the forest areas, which have to be actually carried out as per the sanctioned working plans, they are carried out according to the annual working schemes, which is again contradictory to the National Working Plan Code. These are certain provisions which are again contradictory to the soul of the Act. In 2014, orders were issued by Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change for executing the linear projects. Actually, the sanctions under the Forest Conservation Act is given in 2 stages. In the first stage, principal approval is granted, and then the second stage, final approval is granted. So, in October 2014, the orders were issued that for the execution of the linear projects can be started immediately after the grant of principal approval. Now, this provision is also against the clause 4.2 of Forest Conservation Guidelines, which clearly states that all the approvals have to be granted in 2 stages. And in such a case, there are certain disparities that how do we prevent a user agency which, after the grant of principal approval, executes the whole project and then does not pursue for the grant of final approval? That becomes a big question. Again, the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change has delinked the forest clearance from environmental clearance. These two are like 2 sides of the same coin, and we actually cannot delink them. Suppose there is a project which involves forest clearance and as well as environmental clearance, which are given by 2 separate entities of the same ministry. And the project also involves forest land as well as non-forest land. And the user agency, after the grant of environmental clearance, starts working in the non-forest land. And subsequently, the approval forest clearance, in fact, is not granted. Then what happens is that all the works which are executed in the non-forest land, they all become futile. And the orders of the Honorable Supreme Court, because Honorable Supreme Court has clearly stated that works in non-forest land and forest land, if there is such a project, then works can be executed only after the grant of all the clearances. So the orders of the Honorable Supreme Court are also violated in such a case. What I'm trying to emphasize through all these points is what happens that over a period of time we keep issuing orders without taking into consideration the previous precedences, and so what creates in all is a mess. And that is what has happened with this short and very specific act. Now there is total restriction as per the section 2 of the Forest Conservation Act, there is total restriction on the dereservation of forest. The Honorable Supreme Court has also very clearly stated that there is total restriction on the dereservation of forest. But taking the clause 27 of Indian Forest Act, there have been several instances where our own forest officers also, they have denotified section 4 notified areas. So dereservation is a continuous process which is still happening. Now MOEF by its order of 2014 has laid down special provisions for compensatory afforestation over degraded forest land for certain cases. Ultra mega power projects are one of them. These are also contradictory to the nature and soul of the Act. These are certain other provisions, construction of retail outlets, because actually there is a power to the state governments to grant approvals for projects involving forest land less than 1 hectare. But since there is no enabling clause in the Act, actually all such approvals granted by the state government are in violation of the Act. They are all illegal. And in case all those are valid, the power to grant approvals for construction of retail outlets along roadsides should have been vested again with the state government long time back. So both these things are again contradictory. Now, these are again certain clauses and provisions which are against the spirit and soul of the Act. There are a few suggestive provisions, like in case of diversion of forest land, like I've seen in many developed nations already happening. If a road is passing through a compact forest block, we can have typical specific provisions for construction of underpasses and overbridges. And why do we obstruct our compact forest blocks? We do not have much left. And compensatory afforestation should be always emphatically done by the Forest Department at the cost of user agency. In linear projects, instead of going through the tedious process of granting approvals in 2 stages, we can always have a pre-bid conference kind of a thing in which all the user agencies and the project and the effective departments, they sit together and decide on the whether the project has to be called off or it has to be implemented with certain modifications and modalities. Now, Forest Conservation Act is the prime act in the country for the conservation of forest. It is one of the briefest and the simplest act, but the orders issued from time to time have rendered the soul of the act incoherent. The orders have to be given legal sanctity by requisite amendment of the act. We have had Indian Forest Act, Forest Conservation Act, now Forest Rights Act. Where are we actually heading to? This is the thought which I leave you all to ponder on, especially the policy senior officers here, so that we can introspect and come out with the requisite amendments in the Act so that the Act is implemented effectively and it is able to create the impact it was supposed to. Thank you so much for your patient hearing. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gangwar. And now let's welcome David Andrew Wardell. His presentation is on moving beyond governance in silos in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Does it come up on the screen?
Yeah.
Yeah, it will do. Okay.
Next.
Thanks very much. And the next slide is that one.
Next slide and previous slide.
Thank you very much, Courtney. And good afternoon to all of those who've made it this far. I'm going to talk about a country that you probably don't hear much about at Commonwealth Forestry Conferences, partly because the Democratic Republic of Congo is not a member of the Commonwealth. But I decided when I submitted this abstract for consideration for presentation at this session, I wanted to try and present a very unusual case, to present a very different perspective in terms of the challenges which are being faced by some countries. Very different to the challenges I think we've heard about over the last 2 or 3 days. And it's called Moving Beyond Governance in Silos, Challenges and Opportunities in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And before I start, I want to thank Rob. I don't know if he's in the room. Some of you may have noticed yesterday when he presented a slide that showed the top, I think, 10 ranking on a global scale of countries with the highest area of forest per capita. One country was on that chart, and it just had 3 letters, DRC. And probably for many of you, DRC, maybe you know it as the Democratic Republic of Congo, but in many fora it's presented as DRC without people knowing the name of the country. It's the 5th largest area of forest per capita anywhere in the world, and the 2nd largest contiguous area of tropical forest in the world after Brazil. So the key questions that have guided this presentation, and I stress this is work in progress, are 1, how do you build capacity where limited capacity already exists? And the second question which underpins this research is, can a landscape approach help us move beyond governing land and forest resources in silos? And I ask, based on some of the ongoing archival research that I'm doing in different sources of archives, both in the Democratic Republic of Congo but also in Belgium, is this new? And I found an article published in the Bulletin du Congo Belge in 1938 by a forester, a Belgian forester by the name of Tonder, who said, and he wrote in 1938, c'est donc en tout premier lieu en perfectionnant l'agriculture indigène que l'on assurera l'avenir de la forêt. Now I'm sure all of you speak French, but I'll give you a quick translation. It's ultimately only by addressing and improving traditional agricultural practices that we will be able to secure the future of forests. This was written in 1938. What is a landscape approach? Just so we clarify this. This is a working definition I've developed based on recent published research, which I've defined broadly as a framework to integrate policy, practice, and financing for multiple land uses within a given area to ensure equitable and sustainable use of land and resources, while strengthening governance and measures to mitigate and adapt to climate change. I'm quite willing to share this presentation for those of us. We had a discussion yesterday in the ECMOD session on definitions of landscape approaches. So a quick overview. I'm going to give you a little history of forestry as a science of empire, a little overview of the current state of the forests in the Congo Basin, including in the DRC, some of the key and dominant emerging trends, and then a summary of some of the domestic reforms that were introduced during a decade after 2002, and contrast those with some of the externally driven governance frameworks, very quickly touching on CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, FSC, FLEGT and the VPA negotiations, RED+, and the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. So 5 different governance frameworks, all of which are being driven through either international agreements or externally driven by donors, policy frameworks. And lastly, I'm going to talk about C4's own particular approach to improving governance through capacity building before making some concluding remarks. Firstly, just to remind you that forestry is very much a science of empire. To the best of my knowledge, the first King's Rainforest, as it was called, was established in 1601 in Trinidad and Tobago, long before Colbert adopted the Forest Ordinance in France, or John Silver adopted his famous silvicultural text with regard to UK forestry. And the Empire Forestry Mix, as it's known, which began with Lord Dalhousie's Forest Charter in 1855, building on experiences in India and Burma, essentially had 3 main parts. It was the creation of national networks of protected areas, national parks, forest reserves, game-controlled areas. It was to extract timber as a source of revenue, and particularly after 1900, when most colonial administrations suffered from budget cuts, to actually help pay for colonial administration. And it was to introduce the principles of scientific forestry, but which largely revolved around regulation of timber and woodfall extraction, control of bushfires, reforestation, etc. And you already heard John in the inaugural session refer to the first 2 Empire Forestry Conferences. Well, it was at the 3rd Empire Forestry Conference that was held in 1928 in Australia and New Zealand that the first global 8-point forest policy framework was adopted, and which, in my view, the sophistication of the language has changed, still frames much of the forestry policy interventions that guide our work to this day. Now, why the Congo Belge? The Belgian colony in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. I've included it because Congo Belge was shaped by experiences of other European colonial powers, notably the British, the Dutch, and the French. And after World War II in 1945, Congo Belge also influenced, because of a major investment they made in the Democratic Republic of Congo, it also started to influence other colonial forestry departments in both Anglophone and Francophone Africa. What is distinct about the Congo Belge? It's the only country in the whole of the continent of sub-Saharan Africa in which there was an independent state of Congo established for several years before it became a colony. And this was the independent state that was ruled by King Leopold, and which was, in brief, characterized by considerable brutality, but essentially extraction of slaves, ivory, rubber, and some other timber-related products. And it was only after 1899 that a series of prospections and exploratory missions were undertaken by some quite senior Belgian officials to actually look at establishing from 1908 a formal colony. What is interesting, and I just want to highlight, I'm not going to go through all these points, it was only in 1933 that the first legal instrument was adopted to actually organize the administration of the colony. In the same year that the Belgians established a professional union of producers of wood from Congo Belge. So the same year they set up an administration, they had a union of exporters of timber from Congo also established. The other important point I want to highlight is that the first decree establishing in effect the Forest Code, the Forest Ordinance, was established in 1949. And that continued to be the legislation that governed the forest sector in the Democratic Republic of Congo until 2002. Now, in terms of the importance of DRC as a country and its forest cover, the total land area is 2.3 million kilometers squared, of which 68%, 1.54 million kilometers squared, is under forest. It's the 5th largest area of forest per capita in the world, 2nd largest area of contiguous tropical forest after Brazil. But in 2005, when CIFOR, together with FAO, conducted a study about the existing capacities in the Democratic Republic of Congo, we were astonished to establish that in that year, there were only 6 masters qualified foresters in the National Forestry Research Institutions. I repeat, 6 masters qualified, not a single PhD holder. I've slowly been able to piece together the data regarding another country. I'd be intrigued to find out from you in India what the comparable figure would be in India. But in Brazil in the same year, Embrapa, the National Research Institution, had 8,500 PhDs. So I come back to one of the opening questions I raised. How do you build capacity where limited capacity already exists? And so, between 2007 and continuing to this day, CIFOR took on the rather ambitious and some would say naive task of trying to address this problem. And between 2007 and 2016, we have now trained 115 master students and 14 PhDs who've defended at European universities. All this with the support from the European Commission. And we've just secured another grant for another 5 years to continue this process and train an additional 60 master students and up to an additional 10 PhDs. And again, just to highlight, this is a drop in the ocean. But between 2013 and 2016, for the first time in the country at this University of Kisangani, the students have published 31 articles in peer-reviewed journals. We started at 0, so the impact is significant, but it's still a drop in the ocean. The state of the forests. This is an extract from a report that's published every 2 or 3 years, and just highlights. I don't know if this has a pointer. Does it? No, I can't. Does it work? How do I?
This one.
Okay. So if you look at the column down here, RDC.
No.
Over there, no, you can't. You can see RDC, the second from bottom line in the table. You can actually see that, as I think some people have alluded to, rates of deforestation are actually increasing. However, there are some encouraging signs. Based on additional papers that have been published in international journals, forest degradation between 2000 and 2010 within logging permitted areas was 3.8 times higher. Forest degradation within protected areas was 3.7 times lower, suggesting that the establishment from 1925 of a network of protected areas has actually helped to slow rates of deforestation and forest degradation. But the annual rates of primary forest loss have actually declined in the more recent decade compared to the period 1990 to 2000. But this in a context of what are the dominant trends that are emerging in the DRC as in the Congo Basin. There is growing evidence of increasing competition for land use, for agriculture, as we've heard, for bioenergy plantations, for REDD+ concessions, for new conservation areas, for mining, and many of the associated risks. We've already seen early evidence of large-scale land acquisitions, not always in accordance with existing legislation. And for those of you who know, the second analytical report of the International Land Coalition was published last year, which has some interesting findings, particularly about the DRC. New oil and gas reserves have been discovered, some of them in the border areas between DRC and Rwanda and Burundi, and notably under the Virunga National Park. We've also seen a significant change in end markets, particularly as more and more timber is moving to the Asia-Pacific region, and there are declining timber exports to the EU. Interestingly, we've seen a significant change in global capital flows, which historically have been north-south, and which increasingly are south-south. And there's been for the period up to 2012, 32% of global capital flows were to emerging economies, which represented a six-fold increase since 2000. And we're talking about something of the order of $2 trillion in South-South foreign investments. I stress these are not investments necessarily in forestry or agriculture. We've also seen the emergence of these new transboundary regulations, such as the FLEGT, EU Timber Regulation, the Lacey Act. And in the context of RED, the undelivered promise of forest carbon finance. There is no finance to date. And in terms of sectoral interest, the focus is still very much on timber. However, to give credit to the government of the Democratic Republic of Congo, they did engage in a series of staggered reforms during this decade, 2002 to 2011, where they eventually started to revise this colonial decree which had existed since 1949. These domestic reforms were strongly influenced by international financial institutions and were undertaken through three cycles of sectoral reforms. There were significant fiscal reforms regarding forest concessions. There were legal reforms with regard to the rights of forest concessionaires, which resulted in a massive reduction in the number of concessionaires and active concessions that came down from something of the order of 49 million hectares to 12 million hectares, which are currently under active concessions. And there were institutional reforms, including the reorganization of the old Ministry of Environment. A new poverty reduction strategy, a new environment, water, forest and diversity project was adopted. But to this day, the forest sector, as we've heard from John earlier today, still represents less than 1% of GDP. But critically in this country, we have an aging civil service, and largely because of World Bank policies which were introduced as part of these reforms, there's been a total absence of new recruitment to the public sector since about 2002. And to distinguish the characteristics, as per the title of this presentation, it's still characterized by governance in silos, after 40 years of external assistance and multiple instruments. So now what I want to do is very quickly go through the 5 examples of the types of governance frameworks which have been introduced. And I want to focus not on all the detail in the slides, but the sort of 2 key weaknesses that I've highlighted at the bottom of each of these slides. CITES, as you may know, was adopted in 1973, DRC ratified it in 1975. And DRC is the home of the first tropical timber species that was listed in Appendix 2 since 1992, the Afromosia, Pericopsis elata. And it's been through a whole series of attempts related to the key instruments of CITES, the review of significant trade, the non-detriment findings, to try and establish a scientifically based basis under which they can make their estimates about annual allowable cuts. Okay, sorry, I'm going to have to get... Can I have 5 more minutes? Essentially, the problem with CITES are the weak national capacities, both of management and scientific authorities, as well as inadequate forest inventory data. The inadequacy of CITES timber legality verification process. FSC certification in the Congo Basin has probably had, in terms of the areas, some of the greatest success anywhere in the world. Something of the order of 5.3 million hectares have been certified. But this is only 7 to 13% of all forest management units in the region. And we conducted a study comparing 3 countries in the Congo Basin, 3 concessions with and 3 concessions without FSC, and found that there were definite improvements, but there was still a long way to go, and that the risk that was being courted by FSC, that this as a non-state actor behaving like a state, was risking a substitution of capacity without building capacity within the country. The FLEGT VPA approach, which is market-based, but in the context of a declining EU market, CIFOR conducted research in 5 countries, including the Democratic Republic of Congo, which was published in 2014, where we were able to establish that 91% of all timber harvested in the DRC is harvested informally. Only 9% of the timber which is exported from forest concessions formally is formally done so. And here again, citing a study from Chatham House, it is unlikely that European policy efforts have had any serious effect on global rates of illegal logging. And in the case of DRC, there is no voluntary partnership agreement. So if you look at this table, you can see how significant the annual consumption from informal chainsaw milling It's over 1 million cubic meters. This is the 91%, compared to a much smaller proportion of timber which is actually harvested formally from concessions. In terms of RED Plus, a fund-based mechanism, 90% of all RED interventions in the DRC are funded by public funding. There's very little public money, private money. And one of the reasons for this, as noted in, again, a C4 study conducted in DRC as part of a global comparative study, is that the key governance reforms which have not taken place mean that no investor is willing to come and invest in the country. This is compounded by the fact that to date, under RED Plus, there is no fungible global compliance market. It's still completely outside of any compliance market. But lastly, just to give you a contrasting example, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative process in DRC has been going on for the best part of almost more than a decade. And in July 2014, the country was established as being compliant with the 7 conditions under EITI, essentially saying you're a good governance country. We contested this on the basis of the fact that the third attempt to get accreditation had tried to include timber as part of the extractive industries, and this was dropped from the process, and we still don't know why. So in the same year it was compliant, as I repeat, 91% of the timber that was being extracted was being done so informally. So what have we done at C4 given these complications and challenges with some of these governance sectors? We've argued that until and unless you build capacity and you develop and establish a new professional cadre of foresters, you're not going to be able to address many of these governance reforms. So our strategy in DRC has been improving governance through capacity building, embedded within national plans at the University of Kisangani, one of the 3 most ranked universities in the country, under a national program for teaching and planning. And we've been strengthening and supporting teaching and research quality with C4 and multiple partners from Belgium, the Centre for International Sustainable Development Law at Cambridge and McGill universities, and many implementing organizations including CIRAD, WWF, INBA, and the Musée Royal d'Afrique Centrale. And at the moment, we are co-supervising 40 master's students and 10 PhD candidates. We've improved access, you may take this as being funny, to electricity. When we started, there was no electricity and no internet. We've provided CD-ROMs and more recently USB keys to provide recently published literature to students who are starved of access to any online information. And we've tried to build administrative capacities to support the university, as well as improving communications and introducing something which is in its 4th year, Science Week for the students. So to conclude, please. We need to re-establish a professional cadre of new foresters with a better understanding of inter alia law, rights, landscape approaches, and multilateral environmental agreements to support the next generation of nationally led reforms, which we think are going to take place in 2021. And even though we're still governing in silos distinguished by weak horizontal and vertical coordination, and a phenomenon that I've called in some research policy displacement, we still think there are opportunities to improve on this by adopting a landscape approach. The oil and gas sector is still king, but I ask the question, perhaps we can learn from the non-renewable natural resource sectors. And I would argue that a domestically driven policy, institutional and legislative reform process is more likely to succeed in the long term, given the experience in India and Brazil, than externally driven policy interventions. We certainly need to improve governance and law enforcement, but we need to have more clearly defined short, medium and long-term targets. And to increase transparency in decision-making, notably with regard to land administration and the identification of truly available land with local communities, and transparency in investments, both driven by domestic investors and foreign direct investment. And we certainly need to strengthen broader capacity building efforts, notably with regard to land use, spatial planning, and the environmental and social impact assessment regulations. Thank you for your patience.
I'd like to thank Dr. Gangwar and Dr. Wardell for their incisive presentations on the governance aspects of forestry in India and in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We'd like to take now some questions, and I would encourage everyone to really focus on your questions for the presenters first and foremost.
My question is to Ma'am Prachi. Ma'am, even after 37 years of implementation of that act, still we are telling that we don't have that provision, we don't have this provision. So what is the lacuna? And still we are depending on IFA 1927 for most of the things. So what would be the roadmap for at least amending this act or strict implementation of this particular strong act?
Actually, you know, after so many years of effectively when the act came into force, we are still striving for effective implementation of the act. This clearly indicates that in one way or the other, we are somewhere lagging behind with our objective of conservation. This is still one of the, shortest act, and it is very clear in its objective, but through various orders which have been subsequently issued over a period of time, what we have done, we have complicated the entire act and the guidelines, and that is one reason why there is no clarity on the part of the government as well as for the user agency as well. When we are not able to understand, how will we be able to convince the user agency? So that is one lacuna, and it surely would be addressed. There are FCA rules were amended in 2014, and certain disparities were addressed, and maybe next time when the other amendment takes place, that is why this forum was selected, so that I can address these issues, and all the senior officers who are here, these can be brought into their knowledge, and maybe we'll have another amendment into force, and so that these disparities as well can be addressed. Thank you.
So other questions? This gentleman in front, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Solomon from Cameroon. I wish to congratulate David Andrew for his very exhaustive presentation on the Congo, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Cameroon too is part of the Congo Basin Forest Reserve. Going to the beginning of his presentation, he did ask a few questions, one of which was, how do you build capacity where limited capacity already exists? From the statistics that he gave us, I want to make a comment that, in my opinion, the capacity is not even there. From 6 master's degree holders and no PhD student, at the time CFC carried out this study, for me, there is no limited capacity. This is virtually no capacity at all. If we go by the statistics that you gave of the size of the Congo Basin forests, which comes second to that of Brazil in terms of tropical forests. And then he did talk also about illegal timber exploitation in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which goes up to 91%. Is this due to corruption? Or what could be the cause of this excessively high rate of illegal timber exploitation? Second, in that same connection, does this account for the low percentage of recorded contribution to the GDP of the Democratic Republic of the Congo? Because you did mention that the timber contributes maybe 1% or 2% to the GDP of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Does it mean that actually timber gives a lot of revenue, but this is not recorded because of illegal exploitation? Or maybe it is the other way around? Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much for your 2 questions. I'll try and answer them. I would agree with you, 6 master's degrees for an area of forest in the DRC is effectively no capacity at all. And this is why we took a deep breath. The chairman of our board at the time is sitting in the same row as you, and he supported this initiative at that time, that there is no choice. You have to build new capacity. What I didn't mention is the DRC has been a country that's been ravaged by 2 civil wars. and which has also depleted the professional card. So yes, there is a huge challenge. In terms of the informal, this was a study that came out of an EC finance project called Proformal that looked at Indonesia, DRC, Cameroon, Gabon, and Ecuador. So it was a global comparative study, and certainly in the Congo Basin, the DRC is by far the largest producer. We were surprised ourselves to note the extent that it was informal, chainsaw-based exploitation. What explains this are two factors. One is that the informal sector represents a very important source of revenue for many of the rural Congolese. It's of little benefit to the state. However, it is of benefit to a very complex network of beneficiaries, some of whom represent the state in terms of what in French they call the taxe sauvage. You as a Cameroonian probably understand what that means, the savage taxes. And these are the rent-seeking opportunities that are created through barriers that are controlling movement of timber, barriers controlling the issuing of permits, etc., etc. There's a lot of redistribution of those benefits. But the fundamental problem is the state only recognized the formal sector, the concessionaires, the big, large-scale companies, and they don't recognize the informal. And at C4, based on work on corruption that's been done by Luca Tacconi and others at the Australian National University and C4's own research, we make a distinction between what we call informal activities as distinct from illegal. Because the challenge we all face is, if you make the 91% illegal, how many hundreds of thousands of Congolese do you then put in prison? And that's not a road that at C4 we're willing to go down. So we're looking at ways in which we can improve the regulation, ultimately see ways in which it may lead to improved benefits, both for the state, but without pushing people further into poverty. And that is the risk if we criminalize these types of activities. And we very strongly enforce in our research that that is not a compromise we're willing to do. That also explains partly the second question, why is it still only 1% of GDP? And that is because this 91% of timber harvested doesn't enter into any GDP figures. The second reason is that oil and gas is such a much larger source of income for the country that it dwarfs the forestry sector. But the forestry sector is chronically, as John alluded to in his presentation this morning, is chronically underreported because of the weaknesses in our own reporting systems, which tend to focus on formal figures and formal exports, and exports only. One of the achievements that C4 made, and I should credit my colleague Paolo Ceruti, who used to be in our Cameroon office, from his work in Cameroon, was to actually shift the EU's original plans under the FLEGT process, which was only looking at the export market. And we convinced the EC that this was nonsense. Even if you improve the formality of the export market and 91% of the timber is still exploited informally, what's the net gain? And so now 4 out of the 5 voluntary partnership agreements that have been negotiated in Africa, not in the DRC, they are looking at both the export trade but also the domestic trade. So I hope I answered the question.
Thank you. This gentleman in front, please.
Thank you. I had a question for both the speakers. They're related to Dr. Prakash. The legislation that you described is very similar to legislation in other countries, such as Canada or the USA. So the compensatory planting is very similar. But there it is quite successful. And you described very, very low levels of compliance. And I'm wondering how that could be happening, given there's strong federal and state forest services with big staffs who should be able to actually ensure compliance. Related to that, Dr. Wardell, you talked about how there is a need for more foresters and a new cadre of foresters you actually described. I'm wondering where they're coming from, because you talked about university training, but neither of the universities, McGill and Cambridge, actually have forestry capacity. So who's training these foresters?
question actually that would address most of the part of my presentation as well. What happens is, because I didn't touch this part, the monitoring, the state forest departments, once the permission is granted by the central government, and then the state forest departments have to ensure the compliance of all the conditions which are imposed while granting permission. And what happens if there are certain shortcomings noticed in the compliance, they have to report back to the central government. Once they notice those shortcomings and they report back to the central government is required to take action. Now again, what happens is that, as I told, that the penal clauses in the Act, they are not very strong enough. They have not been very elaborately, detailed upon that what are the modalities under which a person can be booked under the Forest Conservation Act. So that is one lacuna actually. We need, as I said, that the clauses 3A and according to the clauses 3A and 3B, the head of the department or a person directly in charge of the work is required to pass an order for any such activities which is actually prohibited under the Section 2 of the Forest Conservation Act. And if such a head of department or a work in charge would pass an order, that would be involving either encroachment or illicit felling. And the guidelines, forest conservation guidelines further clarify that if the cases of illicit felling, encroachment, mining, etc. have to be dealt under the Indian Forest Act. So what happens, this is like a bouncing ball. The state government would report the compliance to the central government stating that these are the shortcomings noticed, but we are not able to book a person because there are no such provisions in the Act to book. And then we would be asking the state government to book under IFA, under a different act, that is the Indian Forest Act. And this game becomes an endless kind of a thing, and that is what these shortcomings actually have to be addressed in the Act. That is what I was talking about. Thank you.
Very interesting question. I think in my slide I referred to a new cadre of new foresters, with inverted commas around new foresters. And then I gave examples, I think, of the needs to know more about rights and law and various other aspects. The way we're doing this is through a mosaic of partnerships. So in terms of the formal forestry education, we have very strong partnerships with the University of Jean-Blou, the Catholic University of Louvain, all of which have a very credible forestry record going back to the colonial period. But over and above that, we've been trying to move out of the silos of simply just working with forestry faculties. And just to illustrate that, we had an interesting experience more than 5 years ago when we introduced the idea of introducing law as part of a 2-year master's degree in natural resources or management of natural resources. And this was refused. And the Faculty of Science said, no, if you want to do law, you go to the Faculty of Law. And when we talked to the Faculty of Law, they said, well, if you want to do science, you go to the Faculty of Science. And it took us 3 years to break down those silos and those departmental walls, and to actually get then 2 members of the law faculty seconded to the science faculty, and where we've developed 12 modular year 1 and 12 modular year 2 courses, each 3 ECTS, so that each of those master's students, when they come out of the new master's training, actually have a recognition and knowledge of the legal frameworks regarding natural resources of their own country, and some basis of comparative work vis-a-vis other countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So I hope that we still have the core on the forestry, but it's being enriched with these other courses to try and ensure that we have a new generation of professional foresters.
Thank you. We have 2 more questions over here that have been waiting. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. My question goes to the second speaker on the Democratic Republic of Congo. I think having reviewed the policy and the Forestry Act of the Republic of Congo, there must be some similarities on how we look at, the program of action that states on the short, medium, and long-term programs, and at the end of the day, how will it affect the welfare of the society? Then secondly, when we look at the act, is it really working? That is the Forestry Act. in Congo, because it borders on governance. Governance, spreads on openness, accountability, and what have you. And we are now talking about capacity building. When we talk about capacity building, we really look at it from the organization, the individual, and the government per se. The question was posed to us yesterday. In some countries, are we sufficient to meet the needs of today? Democratic Republic of Congo has been since. I will just pose that question to you, sir. Is Democratic Republic of Congo be able to meet the needs of today because of the capacity building that was not there? Those people who should have been educated in order to meet the efficiency of their forest, effectiveness and sustainability. If you are talking about 91% of forest product being extracted and was not recorded for the GDP, I think it's a great loss for that country. So I just want you to clarify something now. How far have they gone in order to reduce this corruption? Thank you.
Okay, I'm not sure the point you made at the end, how far they've gone to address corruption. Was that the question? Okay, I think probably the best way I can answer that is to say some initial steps have been taken to address very deeply rooted corruption. But as I tried to say in my last intervention vis-a-vis another colleague from Cameroon, one of the issues that we have to be extremely careful of is to avoid criminalizing the activities of a very large number, we're talking about tens if not hundreds of thousands of rural Congolese who depend on extraction of timber to support their livelihoods. That is something neither the donors nor the government want. In some ways it might be the easiest response for a government to do. But then, as I said, do we then put all those chainsaw millers into prison and all the people who carry the timber out of the forest into prison? Of course not. It wouldn't be endorsed by the donors or the government. So we have to look at ways to try and reduce the corruption. I would hesitate to use the corruption term too literally when it comes to even redistribution in terms of some of the rents which are being shared in the value chains and how timber is produced and marketed. But there are other legal experts, quote unquote, who disagree with me. They think it's either legal or it's illegal. But I don't support that view. But I still think there's a long way to go. And part of the reason for that is that the Democratic Republic of Congo has gone through a recent decentralization process, but it's a country which has extremely limited resources. And I think the World Bank knows from some recent evaluations of their own projects in the DRC, there are enormous performance issues as well. So it's not gone, and there's still a long way to go, but we felt the best approach for an international research organization was to try and address this governance by trying to build a new capacity. And so as an example, when I first started in DRC back in 2010, the recruitment process for students who wanted to gain entry into the master's course was you had to have a father, a mother, an uncle or an aunt who was a professor at the university, and then you were guaranteed a place at the university. I'm not joking. We introduced a merit-based system based on an entry examination, looking at rounded education with an exam which is conducted every 2 years for a new cohort of 20 masters in Goma, in northeast DRC, in Lubumbashi, in Kinshasa, and in Kisangani. So there's no geographic limit. Anyone all around the country can apply. And it's an examination to look at competency in English, French, mathematics, logic, and general knowledge. And on the basis of who are the top 20 candidates with the best results, they are the ones who are admitted. And this met huge resistance. I received lots of personal threats because this changed the existing system. But we stuck to it. And slowly, over time, I think it's become accepted. And we have a similar recruitment process for the PhD candidates. It's based on an open entry competition. And the best candidates are selected.
Thank you. And one more question over here, and then we'll come to this side.
Okay. A question about working plans. There's a long tradition of doing working plans here in India. I know there are a lot of them stored here in the library. But I gather there's some problems with working plans. What are they?
Thank you actually for your question first. There are no actually major hurdles with the working plans except for that maybe the lack of willpower in the state government. Because what happens is there are certain states which have, have a regular process of looking into which are the working plans which have to be now started working upon, and so they regularly, because we do not have regular posts of a working plan officer in most of the divisions of the country. So most of the states, what they do is when the working plan of any division is scheduled, they would post a working plan officer, and the process of preparation of the working plan, because it's a long process, it would be started. But this is where we lack in some of the states, that there is no such regular process of appointment of a working plan officer taking place. And what I can say is that is just due to lack of the willpower of the state forest departments and nothing else. Thank you.
I'm Vinay Sinha. I will start with the observation which has been put forward by Andrews, that informal thing versus illegal thing. And there lies the crux. Basically, law enforcement is always something which is negotiated with larger society. And in that situation, the implementation of law is not exact translation of what is written in the law, but how actually it could be translated looking at broader aspirations of the community versus the need of the objective of the law. And I think this distinction is very important, coming down to what Prachi has talked about. When we talk about the guidelines under the Forest Conservation Act, the guidelines fall outside the rigid frame of statutory provisions. They are neither act nor rules. If they are not rules, they provide a basic framework how you are going to use your discretion. And in that case, any deviation from guideline cannot be necessarily called illegal. That may be inconsistent, but they cannot be called illegal. And I think this is Forest Conservation Act being governed by guideline is a very unique situation where law enforcement is not through statutory instruments, but through an instrument which describes your discretionary approach to implementation of the law, and that creates a lot of problem. Now coming down to working plan, the issue is that working plan writing is not similar across the country. There are states, provinces where you have 80% or more area under current working plan. There could be places where you have less than area. So my question to Prachi is that, do you really consider guideline as equivalent to statutory provision? And second question to Andrews, that I understand your concern that everybody should not be labeled as criminal, but where you will put the line between illegal and informal? That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your question, actually. Being there in the regional office of the ministry, since I've worked there, so what I observed was, because the guidelines are so open-ended and we have left it to the discretion of the officers, to interpret it the way they want to, and that is, I think, one of the major reasons why we have landed up in such a mess. Because when I analyze the situation across the country, I realize that it is totally to the discretion of the officers, the way they have interpreted the act and the guidelines, and they have implemented it. So maybe I can cite instances as well, sir, to you during the tea break, because I would not like to go upon naming the states as such. That's why I didn't mention it in my presentation. But this is the major reason that what I feel is that we should not depend on the guidelines and the orders issued. We should make the necessary amendments and the provisions in the rules and the act so that they have more legal sanctity, sir. I hope that answers your question, sir. Thank you so much. So we will have a discussion over tea, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your very easy question, which I'm not going to answer because I don't think there is an answer. Where do you draw the line between legal and illegal? I think it's an extremely difficult line to draw. All I will say, because I haven't mentioned this before, one of the additional complications which may be distinct from the Indian context and which is a characteristic of many sub-Saharan African countries is the juxtaposition between statutory legal frameworks and customary legal frameworks. And the distinction that that creates in terms of whose law actually counts. Under a customary law arrangement, a customary chief may provide the authorization of access into the forests, which may be considered as a forest under a government act. But that only happened after the colonial period. Before the act was passed, those were customary lands. And it was only because of the Belgians who came in, or the British in India, or the French in West Africa or Indochina that decided, whether it was for conservation reasons or animal wildlife, this area is now a protected area. Often not without consultation. In India, Lord Baden-Powell introduced the institution of the Reserve Settlement Commissioners, which was then used in West Africa, in Ghana, for example, in the 1950s, as an independent way of assessing what are the existing rights before an area was gazetted. We don't have anything like that in the contemporary era in many African countries. New conservation areas are being established with little, if any, consultation with local communities. So that is an additional complication. And as you rightly said at the beginning, law for me, whether it's statutory or customary, is a framework of negotiation. And always will be.
Thank you. We'll just take one more question in the front.
Thank you, Chair. I have two questions. One is for David Andrew. Let us talk more about how to make it formal. In your presentation, you have, in an excellent manner, talked about capacity building of the people or foresters or who are supposed to manage the forest. But I would be keen to know that since the DRC stands fifth in the world so far as per capita forest is concerned. But what about the overall people's participation or from the CBRRM approach, whether they have some say in the forest management, which would automatically lead to, if I presume, to lesser informal illegal felling. Number two, I would like to, second part of the same question is there any mechanism by which we have access and benefit sharing mechanism with the people so that more with the passage of time, with your special effort of C4, with the help of EC countries, we have realization that this belongs to us and we should have more access to the forest or benefit sharing basis. For Prachi, though it would be slightly difficult for you, since you have worked as a research scholar in the state of Uttarakhand, research officer at senior level, then you have worked as a forest conservation officer in the regional office in Lucknow for North India. We are in the process of drafting the national forest policy. It's already in the draft stage. It is yet to be finalized. Though we have working plan code, as you have rightly mentioned, can we further make it more, I would say, stringent? Because at times you feel that, yes, the road is passing through the biodiversity-rich area, or where we as foresters feel that rare endangered species are there, or maybe some of the CITES species are affected. But can we link our future working plan code with the guiding principle for the states? As you have rightly mentioned it, some of the provinces, they don't follow. But more and more we realize that we should have this conservation or preservation of these species and linking with the national forest policy, which is in swing, which is in the finalization stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much for some very interesting questions. The short answer is DRC has not advanced very far with regard to community-based natural resource management. The first legal instrument was only adopted in 2014 and then very quickly withdrawn, and the government is still in the process of trying to revise new guidelines with the intention of putting in a couple of pilots across the country. So it's still very much a novelty in the DRC. There's no record of it throughout the colonial period of attempts to get joint forest management or participatory forest management. So it's still extremely new, certainly in comparison with the experience in India, which goes back to 1970s, if not even earlier. In terms of any mechanism for access and benefit sharing, I would argue that the informal arrangements which exist are probably informal arrangements in terms of the continued access to use the resources, and it's actually the local communities who are benefiting the most. The key gap that I alluded to earlier is if 91% of the timber is being harvested and the state is not benefiting, then there's clearly a gap in terms of how revenues could be generated for the government. But I think I just want to illustrate one other example from the DRC of some research I'm doing with one of my PhD students, which is looking at a documented case study over a period of 80 years between 1934 and the present day of non-respect for a decree that was adopted in 1934 by the Belgian government for compensation arrangements for any land that was acquired to establish, in the case that we're looking at, the Yangambi Forest Research Center. And a particular community called the Turumbu community that live on the western and southwestern edge of this Yangambi Biosphere Reserve have been trying to negotiate for 80 years due compensation, and to this day it is still not resolved. But one of the great things about African societies and the contribution to historiography generally is that African societies are oral societies. They are not written societies, as we are, I think, much more. And those oral traditions are passed on from one generation to another. And the non-respect is never forgotten. It remains very much part of the social memories. And one of the reasons we've been able to document over this long period of time the repeated attempts to try and get compensation. But it reflects this general weak governance in the country.
So thank you so much actually for the question, sir. You've been my mentor since I was in Uttarakhand. So I was a question like this coming from your mind is not a wonder, because you've been always so progressive. And this is what actually we have been thinking for long, that if we can map all our biodiversity rich areas and have that GIS map as a part of our working plan, so that and as well we can map all those areas where diversion of forest land has already taken place, so that in future whenever an area is proposed for further diversion, we can look into those maps, map them, and we will be able to convince ourselves as well as the user agency that while a particular project cannot be approved or it can be approved, I think this is a very good suggestion, and it should be included in the next maybe national, even if it is not included in the National Working Plan Code. All the state forest departments can start implementing it, because it will ease in their work as well. So thank you so much, sir, for addressing that issue. Thank you.
Excuse me, 1 second. Yeah.
Can you make your question very quick? We need to wrap up.
Yeah. My question is related to Forest Conservation Act. There's some comment is also there. No, I appreciate the efforts made by Prachi to present the case, but there are a lot of issues which are not told. And then, it is based on those issues we decide whether a case has to be processed or not processed. And you may be aware that 98.5% of the proposals received from any user agency in the entire country since inception has been accepted under the provisions of the Conservation Act. Basically, it is not a regulatory act, it's an enabling act. You are aware of that. So an enabling act has been put in place by the government in order to facilitate smooth transition of conversion of the forest land into a user agency land for either hydroelectric project or a road project or any other development work. So the constant debate is there. Forest Department is against the what is called development. You are always bothered about conservation. So in order to circumvent the problem, government have come up with the act in 1980. And then at that time, Parliament has approved it. But subsequently, it is not made into a kind of rigid regimental act. It is made into guidelines are issued. So guidelines are made because somebody said it's a vast country. You can't have a uniform guideline throughout the country how a development project should be. The situation is totally different. So it has to cater to the needs of that. So anyway, it's a very good beginning that introspection has to be done by the entire department, and then whatever problems are, loopholes are found in the act. In some states, conveniently they have been converted into good opportunities for promoting, the political interests which are prevailing there. By and large, where 98% of the cases are cleared means that the political executive wants the cases to be just passed through the process, that's all. They don't want any hindrance. That's it. And then, the Wildlife Conservation Act is also there. Under Wildlife Board also, the case has to be cleared. And Pollution Conservation Act is also there. Under pollution clearance also has to be taken. So all these things are being done parallelly. So in such a circumstance, so it was clarified by some of the senior officers to me also. I have put in 30 years of service, but to seniors to me have said that, because, it's an enabling act, it has to be kind of, liberal, but there is need for amendment, there is a need for improvement, there is need for putting the things in right perspective, and so that thinking, we have to think into the future, how to protect our land. And how to protect the forest land.
Do you have a question for Dr. Gangwar?
No, these are, I'm clarifying, because, she could not really answer the questions. And why working plans are not being followed all over the state. 30 years back, there may be a need for preparation of a working plan where there was regular working and coops were there. In most of the states, and I think 18 out of the 29 states, there is no felling at all. And after Conservation Act came into place, entire green felling is banned. So virtually, I come from Andhra Pradesh. Wherever only forest area is there, wherever working is there, required working plans are prepared. And as you said that, because, there is always shortage of resources, officers are there, not there. So whenever there is a need, whenever the working plan is due for revision, the officers are posted and then an attempt is made to prepare it, though not in the best manner in which it should be done, but some working plan. Given the circumstances existing all over the country, shortage of staff, resources, and another thing is that even if we prepare a working plan for every division in the state, it requires about 100,000 lakhs per annum to implement. Because, there is no limit on prescription. Whatever is required to the nature and silviculturally, technically possible, we need to propose it. So, but there is no budgetary support. So the entire budget is coming through schemes.
Thank you, sir. We need to wrap up.
So that is the reason why working plans are not being followed. It is for the clarification of everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you want to respond at all? Just briefly? No? Okay.
All right, thank you to the audience for the very interesting questions, and I want to thank Andrew Wardell and Prachi Gangwar for their presentations and also their thoughtful responses. I have been asked just to wrap up and write up some concluding remarks and observations, so if you'll just indulge me for a moment, I'll share these with you. Dr. Gangwar again talked about regulating the divestment of forest land in India and implications of the Forest Conservation Act, ideas to make it, to improve it and to make it more implementable. She talked about identified the need for policy incentives and portfolios, and so this was an important point I took from her talk, was the need for a number of policies to work together effectively to achieve our forest conservation goals. She also talked about coupling policy with political and community level support, capacity, and adequate funding, and that these are all critical for achieving our goals. In addition, she addressed the inevitable result of all of our histories, that laws often are layered upon former laws and don't always work effectively together. And this necessitates a comprehensive look at policies and for policy reviews. And I think this is where governance scholars and researchers can play a critical role in assessing our forest policy and governance portfolios. Dr. Wardell raised similar questions about capacity and how to build this in the Democratic Republic of Congo. He also discussed the complexity of forest governance today and the critical role, again, of comprehensive policy and governance analyses in an iterative fashion to achieve successful landscape-scale forest management. This requires working across jurisdictions and also is necessary worldwide as forests more and more are asked to serve as habitat for biodiversity, as an important aspect of climate change mitigation policy, and also protection of key watersheds. Both of these scholars addressed aspects of governance solutions. Dr. Wardell discussed C4's role in increasing capacity to move towards these goals, and Dr. Gangwar touched on different aspects for improving forest governance in India under the Conservation Act. So again, key themes of what we're hearing: the need for policy portfolios, support and capacity to support our policy approaches, and also the need for ongoing governance review and analysis. A question I have is, who takes these big picture looks? Who addresses and assesses our policy portfolios and the status of governance across jurisdictions and across nation states? I think here is again where governance scholars and researchers play a critical role. But I think this also speaks to the emerging importance of nested and networked governance approaches and unique partnerships that we're all seeing in forest governance today in this era. So to thank everybody for being here and for the concerted time we had on these two talks. I personally really enjoyed it and hope you did as well, that we had all this time to talk together about these topics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schultz. Now, a token of respect for our presenters, I would request Dr. Schultz to present a memento to Dr. Prachi Gangwar. Thank you so much. And also a memento for Dr. Andrew Wardell. Thank you so much. May I request now Dr. Betullah Mahmoodi to come on stage and present a memento to our moderator of session, Dr. Schultz. Thank you so much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. With this one, we come to end of our sessions, and thank you all for being here. Just a few announcements that there are side events which are going on from 5:30 to 7. One is on forestry education at Extension Hall. The second is by FAO at NFLIC, and third one is by Wildlife Institute in Boardroom. And also a request to be with us at 7 p.m. at Hari Singh Auditorium for an event by students of FRI deemed university. We'll be pleased to have you over there. It's a kind of cultural and well as some shows by students of our university. Thank you. Thank you all.